Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Thibault Schrepel, Assistant Professor in European Economic Law at Utrecht University School of Law. We will discuss his article, Antitrust Without Romance. So welcome to the podcast, Thibault.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I really enjoyed reading your paper. And before we start talking about the substance, I just wanted to ask you a question that was on my mind when I was looking at it, which was the file has this amazing cover on the first page, which I've never seen on a law review article before. And I was wondering, is that something that's common with European or French legal publications? Like, where did that come from? I love it. I kind of want it for all of my own articles, I must tell you.
Well, actually, it's an idea that I got for a paper that I published last year on blockchain and antitrust. And what I've done, and actually you're the first person I'm telling the story, is that I used the cover of Bork book on the antitrust war, antitrust paradox. And I just used the cover and thought it would be funny to use the cover and just to put, the title of my article on that cover and to see if someone will, recognize the cover, although it's all red. So, of course, it will be complicated. And so nobody ever noticed, I guess. So I'm giving you the information.
Starting with the scoop. That's awesome.
Exactly. Yeah. And then I thought, well, actually, I published. So the cover was red, and then I published another paper, and I thought, well, it would be easy to identify the paper as the red paper, and then I published the blue paper. And then I thought, well, this one is about romance, so I have to find something a bit romantic. So that is why I used that cover, which is actually the cover of a book of Friedrich Hayek. So that I used.
Amazing. Very cool. Okay. Awesome. Well, it's fantastic. I totally love it. And it definitely caught my eye. So kudos on that. So the title of your article is really interesting as well, right? Antitrust Without Romance. So why Antitrust Without Romance? Sort of what literature are you referencing with that title?
Sure. So once again, I took the idea from someone else, as academics do all the time, I guess. So it's basically a derivative of the article published by James Buchanan, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, and he wrote a paper called Politics Without Romance. And I thought so it's a really short paper, and the idea was really interesting. It was basically to say that, of course, we do need politics because sometimes, why not? It might do good things. But also we should have a look at the results. And it should be okay to question whether or not the results are great, or if, in fact, some people might use public power for their personal interests and not to benefit the general interests. And so I thought that probably it would be interesting to study if the same was happening in the field of antitrust, especially because now it's such a trendy topic. And, every day nowadays, especially in the US, there is a paper in the New York Times or the Washington Post dealing with, breaking up tech giants and all that. So I thought, well, now it's so trendy that actually it's possible that antitrust might be used not for, what it's supposedly doing, but as a tool for the personal interests. And so that is why I came up with the title Antitrust Without Romance.
Yeah. So Buchanan is known for what's often referred to as public choice theory, which you've sort of obliquely referenced or kind of described already, at least where it came from. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the premises of public choice theory are, sort of why Buchanan thought it was important, and sort of what the sort of key insights were, just so listeners who might not be familiar with public choice theory will understand what you're talking about in the paper.
Well, I'll do my best. So I think his basic idea was to say, so we have the public interest theory, which is the opposite theory, which is to say that Sometimes it's better if we can coordinate actions, and that is why we need politics in some respects. And so that is one part, but also sometimes actually politics and the power granted to some officials is used in a manner that is good for them, but not for the people. And so under the public interest theory, this is presumed. So let's say you see a market failure, you see something which needs to be done, then if the government is doing something, it is presumed to be good because you did have a market failure after all. And Buchanan's idea was to say, well, it's one thing to identify market failures, but also it would be great if after we've done something, if we could compare the market failure, the initial market failure, and what's happening after the action we took. And then we need to balance the two and potentially to prove that, well, yes, there is a market failure, but the thing we've done is actually bad. And so it would have been better to let the market failure. And so it was his basic idea. And so he called that the public choice theory. And he described that as a program. So it wasn't really a theory in a sense of, like the offer and demand or something which is really mathematical, but it was just a way of thinking about the action, the public action, I guess.
So, yeah, and if I understand it correctly, I mean, part of the point of public choice theory is that public actors have incentives that may or may not be aligned with the sort of public benefit. So, as you say, right, the fact that you can identify a market failure and then have the government engage with it doesn't necessarily mean the government's going to succeed. In other words, if the incentives for the government actors are bad, you could have government failures as well as government fixes. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So actually, it's interesting. But the Public Choice Society, which was the debate, the first group of scholars focusing on public choice, was initially called the Committee on Non-Market Decision Making. So their idea was to say, well, we need to apply the mechanism and the way of thinking about markets and market failures, which is people have incentive, and sometimes individual incentive is not good for the general good. And you see that very often on markets, of course. And their idea was to say, but we need to apply the same to the people entrusted with public power, because those people, although they work for the government and supposedly they should do what is best for everyone, but they are humans after all, and so they will maximize their personal interests. And so we need to study that using the mechanism that we use, to study market failures. And so there's one formula, which is, officials are not angels. And that's the basic idea, to say, well, they are humans. And so if they are humans, some of them will do what is best. Some of them will do what is best for them only. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, which is, well, sometimes you do, what is best for the markets or the interest you're trying to protect. But at the same time, why not doing what is best for you? Which it could be not a problem at all if the two are aligned. So if what is best for your personal career is also what is best for the country, then it's perfect. But sometimes the two are not aligned at all. And so you will do something for your personal interests and actually will go against the public interest. And it's where it becomes a bit more tricky.
So Buchanan used the term without romance, kind of to imply a way we should and shouldn't think about engagement in economic policy. And I wonder if you could just briefly talk about why you think that is sort of a relevant perspective at this moment in antitrust policy.
So here, actually, I must say that I've been discussing this paper since it's been published for the last 2 weeks with several academics, but also, with people who are not involved in the academic community at all. And they told me, oh, you really think that some people are romantics? And actually, we are not romantic at all, because we know that the government will do what is, best for them and not for us. So which is the extreme opposite. But the basic idea was to say, well, sometimes you do have a market failure. We're not discussing that. So I'm not discussing that at all in the paper. Let's presume there is a market failure and that potentially we should do something. What is done and what part, if not most of the academic community, at least for antitrust, is doing or is not doing precisely, is to study whether or not the thing that we've done is good or is bad. And actually, it's a bit like being in love, right? So the first 2 weeks is amazing, and everything that the person is doing is the best, and you won't ever question that, right? Because you are seeing the person with the glasses of love, I guess, the eyes of love. And that's the same here, which is to say, if you are not studying the actual impact of the action we took against the market failure, then you are, kind of a romantic. You are a bit in love with, public action, and it's actually not a good thing. And you see that very rarely in academic papers or official publications. And actually, I'm sure we will discuss, but none of the three antitrust authorities that I'm studying in the article, which is the European Commission and the two in the US, namely the FTC and the DOJ Antitrust Division, they do not ever mention the potentiality of governmental failure. So, and of course you understand that. Why would they, right? Why would you say, well, what we've done is bad, and please, you should give us less power? It wouldn't make sense, but it would probably make sense for at least academics to study whether or not what they've done is good or is bad. And if we are not doing that, once again, it's because we are, kind of in a romance with them, which is not good, I guess.
Yeah, and it seems to me in the paper, I mean, you suggest that there's a kind of normative move in some antitrust scholarship and policy proposals lately, which sort of intersects with public choice concerns relating to antitrust policymakers in a potentially concerning way. Is that a fair assessment of the point you're making in the paper?
Well, I think we see different trends which are coming together, but indeed part of the U.S. academic community is actually being, well, very romantic, or at least they are using the romance to then argue for things which probably benefits their personal interests. And you see that coming within antitrust agencies as well. And what I try to explain is that all of that is permitted actually because of the design of antitrust agencies. So I'm not sure whether or not I answer your question right now, but that's a trend that is coming from the US and then that we see clearly in Europe, and I'm sure we will discuss, but actually the EU Commissioner for Competition has been embracing that very clearly.
Mm-hmm. So maybe you could talk about what kinds of incentives you think public choice theory predicts would be salient to antitrust regulators. In other words, sort of what are they going to be reacting to according to this perspective on antitrust policy?
So they will be reacting to, so you have different hypotheses, I guess. The first is that they do what is best for the country, or the goal of the authority for which they are working, which of course happens. But also another possibility is that sometimes they might do what is best for them personally, and there are different ways for them to do that. So they could do something just to please the person which is the plus one, just a rank ahead of them in the antitrust authority. But also it could be that what they're trying to do is to please. Let's say if you work for an antitrust agency, they are funded and they are closely linked with, for instance, the parliaments and potentially in the US, the president, who is actually validating the budget of those antitrust authorities. So then what you see is that as an employee of one of those authorities, what you might want to do in order to benefit your personal career is to please, the government because why not? Because if you're not doing that, it's possible that the budget, the fundings of your antitrust authority will go down, and then eventually will impact you. So you could see that you are maximizing your personal interests with different strategies, whether it is directly with your superiors, or if it, more the broader level with the government.
So in your paper, you offer not just this kind of theoretical perspective, but also a really kind of interesting and rich data set about how antitrust regulators actually talk about the policy choices that you're making. And I wonder if you could kind of break down sort of the methodology of your study and why you took that approach and ultimately what you found.
Sure. So what I've tried to do is to study to which extent they will take that, so public choice, or just, let's say, the idea of governmental failure, the possibility, into account. And so what I've done is that I've studied, so the three antitrust authorities I was talking about, I've studied all of their official publications to see whether or not I could find, them mentioning expressively public choice, or the basic concepts, or even if I could find some hints of them applying it. And so the FTC used to do it 30 years ago, but not anymore. And so actually, it's quite, the results are quite easy to interpret, because none of them are mentioning public choice or seems to take that into account. So then I thought, well, so that's a bit weird, but probably not so surprising. So I thought, well, let's presume that indeed they are captured not only by companies sometime, but also by the government, because once again, the government is in the end, the one who's validating the fundings of those authorities. So then I thought, well, if actually I could find that those antitrust agencies are taking action against public companies owned by the government, then it will be a clear sign that they are totally not captured by governments. But what I found once again is that they, so in the US, they don't ever initiate actions against public companies, but you have less public companies that we do have in Europe. So in Europe, it was super interesting, because you could see that 5-10 years ago, about 15% of all of the action initiated by the European Commission were against public companies. And this is going down, which is surprising, because actually the OECD underlined that the part that public companies take in the global economy is increasing. So you would think the more they are doing business, and the more important they become, the more potentially they do things which are anti-competitive. So you see two opposite trends in a sense. They are more important in the economy, and yet you have less actions against them. And what I found is that the actual EU commissioner did not open any investigation against any public companies in the last 5 years. So which means that in the years to come, it will definitely go down. So I thought, well, this is just maybe correlation. It's not causation. So it's not the actual proof that antitrust agencies are captured by governments, but it's still interesting to notice. And so then I went a step further, and I studied all of the speeches given by the actual FTC commissioners, the actual EU commissioner for competition, and the 3 previous ones, to see whether or not I could find, indications that indeed it seems that they are changing their policy, because actually it might be good for them, but not actually, tackling the issues on the market. And so it's what I've done. And I don't know if you want me to discuss those results right now, or if
Sure. Yeah. Like, what did you find? Sort of, how did you structure the way that you analyzed their responses? Or what were you looking for, and what did you find?
So what I thought is that it would be interesting to actually study, and it's actually a theme now in the antitrust circles, to study whether or not, so we talk a lot about the antitrust populism. So it's the idea that, potentially some antitrust policies are coming from populist movements. But actually, what I found is that I never read any study studying the actual populism within antitrust agencies. And so it's what I've done. So I was first looking for signs that could show that those agencies are becoming populist, which would be surprising, but it's actually what I found pretty clearly. And so I thought, well, if they are becoming populist, so I had to read a lot of the literature, on the public science, political science literature on populism, what it is, and the keywords and the kind of speeches that goes along. And so one thing that is super clear is that the us versus them is a clear sign of populism. So what you do basically is that you say us the people, versus them, and them has to be a minority. And you say, if you give me power, I will make sure that us is actually in a better situation than before. And you could do that because anyway, them is so small that you will lose, probably 10 votes, but who cares? Because you're going to win like so much more, with the us, which is the people, the larger community. So I first looked for that. And so what is really interesting is that top officials of those antitrust agencies in the past, when they used the pronoun us, they referred to us as the agency. So us as the team, us, we are working, we are a team, and I'm the president or, the commissioner, but I represent the team. That still exists in the US. So I guess that is good news for you. But in Europe, that is changing with the actual EU commissioner. And now when she refers to us, it's us, the people. It's never us, the European Commission. And on the other end, them is always companies. And that also changed. And you could see that changing a bit in the US as well. Back in the days, let's say 5-10 years ago, so not so long ago, you could see that some of those commissioners were referring to companies using us as well. Us, the people, the companies, we're all, in the same boat, so we should do what is best for the community. And now what you see is that it's not us anymore referring to companies, but they use the pronoun them. So, it's clearly the evil companies. And actually in Europe, you see in some speeches that they refer to death threats referring to those companies. So it's definitely evil. And therefore, because it's evil, we should do something about it, of course. And so that is where public choice, come into practice, where it's actually interesting to see they use that. So it was the first idea was to say, do we have populism? And if we do have populism, is it translated into moralism, which is the second part of the analysis?
So in order to situate listeners at this point, maybe you could just briefly talk about the kind of abstract goal of antitrust policy, how populism might interact with that abstract goal, and also how that interaction might affect the incentives of antitrust regulators.
Sure. That's a big question, actually, which is definitely super trendy in antitrust circles. So I'm going to try to do my best. So the basic idea for the last 30 years, there is a consensus, very clear, whether it is among, in the US progressives and, more Republican side, I guess, that the goal of antitrust should be to protect the consumer. And so here and there, you could read that the standard of antitrust, which is the goal of antitrust, is to protect the consumer, and it's called the consumer welfare standard. And so it means that every time an antitrust agency takes action against a company, that agency has to prove that the practice of the company was hurting consumers. And if the agency can do that, then fine, you could actually sanction the company. And if you cannot do that, then the company has done nothing wrong. That is being challenged, and part of it is absolutely not a populist thing. Some people are saying that the consumer welfare standard is focusing on prices too much, where actually now in the new economy, it doesn't make sense because, to use Google and Facebook and all the services, you are not paying with money, actually paying probably with the data. Whether or not we should use that expression, I'm not sure, but that's a different story. And so they'd say that we need to change the standard. So in short, we need to change the goal of antitrust. That is something we should discuss, and I think it's a debate we should have. But what you also see in parallel is that some people are saying, well, actually we should change the standard of antitrust, because actually antitrust should be used to fight against all types of things, which is actually not covered in the text, the founding text of those agencies. So they would say those agencies are bad because they are big companies. And because of that, big is bad, big is evil, we should do something about it. And we should not even care about the practices of those companies. And that is where you see populism, because obviously, it's not even about studying what the company do on the market, whether or not this is good, this is bad, and empirical studies. We are far away from all that. It's just the idea that those tech companies are so big that it's probably super bad in terms of democracy or any type of political reason, and therefore we should use antitrust not for the thing it was created for, but we should use antitrust as a tool to actually sanction those companies, just for the sake of them being big companies. And so that is related to populism, of course, because then it's the idea that those big companies are evil and actually doing things which are super bad for the consumer, which sometimes could be true. But once again, antitrust should be about empirical evidence and being able to prove it. So the practices and not the size per se, which in theory it's legal to be a big company.
Yeah, I mean, it struck me that there was an extra wrinkle in there too, which is, in a sense, like the populism gives a potentially new license to antitrust regulators, which they may have incentives to take in the direction the populists want or in some other direction. And in a sense, it's almost like sort of unpredictable. Once the populists sort of moralistic thinking about antitrust policy becomes entrenched in terms of what the expectations are, it's hard to say what the actual policymakers will do with it.
Well, yes, because it's actually unrelated to any empirical evidence. So then it becomes, of course, legal certainty is then going down by a lot. And what you see is that, of course, now it's not about whether or not the practice is good or bad, but it becomes indeed a moralist use of antitrust, which is just to say, well, this is the good versus the bad, and who is deciding on what is good and what is bad? Well, of course, it's just a few persons, and it's where it's actually impossible for companies to behave on the markets because they don't know what will be decided to be good or bad, in the next decision. So that is where it's actually very much problematic, and it's not a new issue. The use of moral concepts in antitrust has been an issue, and we have a lot of studies studying that. And once again, on both political sides, we reached an agreement to say, well, moral concept in antitrust is not a good thing because it's actually it doesn't provide company with a good framework on how to act in certain circumstances, and therefore this is why we should take them out of the picture. But now it is back because actually it's super convenient. If you say, well, antitrust is not about studying practices and the effect on the consumer or whatever standard you should use, which is a different story. But it's just that it's bad. It's just bad. Trust me, it's bad. Therefore, you should be sanctioned. Well, it's a bit discretionary to say the least.
So, does your paper advocate any particular sort of antitrust actions, or is it more about how we should think about structuring antitrust policy more generally?
Well, yes, definitely the second option. So once again, I'm not focusing on whether or not we should change the standard, whether or not some practices are actually good for the consumer or bad for the consumer. there are definitely tons of practices that antitrust agencies should, be, working on and probably sanction, because it is probably anti-competitive. And it would be actually, silly to say, well, we should use public choice to prove that sometimes governmental action is not good, but at the same time to say, well, but everything that private companies do is good. I mean, of course it's not. So it should be about, empirical evidence in the end, and not the use of political and moral concepts. So once again, I'm not focusing on, some practices or whether or not, I don't know, predatory pricing is true, it exists, that kind of stuff. But the second part of the paper was more about to say, well, sometimes the design of antitrust agencies is made such that it's possible, if you wish to use public power for your personal interest, you can do so as they are designed as of today. And we should probably change that. And so here are some ideas on how to change that. Of course, aware that, it's going to be super complicated, and I'm not the first one to notice that. But, of course, some antitrust agencies might think, well, but why should we have, less power or a different type of power? But yet you do have also some people coming from both sides of the political spectrum saying that if we could actually find a way to make sure that when antitrust agency do something because they do have, some empirical basis, then it will actually be better even for them, because, in terms of public trust, it's much better to act this way. So yeah, definitely how to redesign antitrust agencies, and also maybe some concepts that they should use or not use as moral concepts.
Right. So Thibault, in closing, you make some sort of preliminary observations about ways we might think about changing antitrust policy in order to better avoid potential public choice problems. I wonder if you could talk about those briefly.
Yes, briefly. So I think first it will be interesting to actually, well, there is something which is definitely broken, I think, is the how we are actually assessing antitrust authorities. And what you see is that when they send their budget request to the Senate or the Parliament in Europe, they also join what is they call the annual assessment form, or whatever the name is, and they focus on the fines they imposed in the last 12 months, as if it was a proof that they were doing a good job. And if they are not sanctioning company, then it's a proof that they are not doing a good job. And I think this is broken, and we should probably think about another way to assess whether or not they are successful, and not to create an incentive for them to fine companies just for the sake of fining companies, although sometimes there is no harm to consumer. At least it's not proven in the decision. So I give some ideas regarding how we should probably rethink all that. Then also I discuss some more micro, I guess, reforms with regards to the personnel of antitrust authorities. One of them could be, for instance, that if you are a top official at some antitrust authority, maybe it would be a good idea if you cannot actually run for election, for instance, in the next 5 years. Or, if your mandate will be limited to 1 term and not 2 terms. That type of reforms, I think, could be useful. One which is more actually probably discussed already is whether or not FTC commissioners and top officials should be experts in the field of antitrust. But what I found doing my study and studying all of the speeches is that the more they are experts in the field of antitrust, the better it is actually, and the least populist they are. So I think it would be also a good idea, if it's not just a politician put there at some point, and not hope for the best in this regard. So that's on the more the institutional side, and some reforms that I propose, which are more related to I guess the substance of antitrust is not to use moral concepts for the reason I briefly discussed. Basically, the idea is that what is good, what is bad, what is moral or not moral, immoral, just depends on everyone's feeling and sentiment, and it's not actually a good framework. So that is one. And the last point I'm making, and I think this one is super important, is to recognize that antitrust, and if you read the text, is super clear. It's not a statement. So it's not about, stating or doing that, reaching a particular goal. If we want to do that, fine, we should discuss, if we want companies to be more fair, whatever that means, then probably we should discuss of how we should do that. But actually, we cannot use antitrust to do that. And if we do so, we are outside the rule of law. So that was the last point of the paper, which is to say antitrust is not a statement. It's just a mean to achieve, competition on the market. And that's it. And then we hope that actually the market will be, shaped in a way that is good for everyone. And if it is not, then let's do something. But let's use, pure politics and not antitrust, because it's not about, moral values. It's about, empirical evidence and showing harm to the consumer as it is today. So it's a point that is where the shift, I think, is very clear on how some people are trying to shift antitrust to use it just, to make a statement on how they think society should be, and not, which is, of course, super personal and not a good thing.
Well, Thibault, thanks so much for talking to me today. I as I said, I really enjoyed reading your paper, and I think it's a really important intervention into a policy discussion that's super timely at the moment. I mean, people are really, this is in the air, and it really helped inform my understanding of the policy debate.
Well, thank you for having me. And yes, romance is in the air. That's for sure. And as a French person, it's a bit weird for me to argue against romance, I guess, but still, it's what I'm trying to do, doing my best.
Against type.
Exactly.
Hello, this is Beverly Garland. The Federal Trade Commission asks you to look beyond the smiling faces and super promises, because the FTC knows that some advertising can be misleading and deceptive. So don't believe everything you see or hear. Beware of extravagant promises and unsupported claims. Check it out before you buy. Shop wisely. You'll save money.
This message is brought to you by the Federal Trade Commission, Washington, D.C.